The desert at night was a void, swallowing all light and sound except for the occasional rasp of wind brushing against the sand. A group of migrants trudged forward, their breath shallow and their bodies weary from days of relentless heat and freezing nights. Among them was Elena, a young mother clutching her son tightly, her eyes darting toward every shadow. The guide, known only as El Coyote, led the group with an unshakable air of authority, though his expression betrayed unease. He glanced over his shoulder more often than seemed necessary, his eyes narrowing at the shifting darkness behind them. The journey had been grueling, but the group pressed on, driven by hope and desperation. For Elena, it was the promise of safety in a land where her son could grow up free from the violence they had fled. For others, it was a chance to escape poverty or persecution. Yet, as the night deepened, a sense of unease began to ripple through the group. The darkness seemed heavier than before, oppressive and alive, as if the desert itself were watching them. It began with whispers. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs carried on the wind. Elena dismissed them as the product of exhaustion. But soon, the whispers grew louder, threading through the night air with eerie clarity. They were in Spanish, English, and indigenous tongues, voices of men, women, and children. "Keep moving," El Coyote barked, his tone sharper than usual. The group obeyed, though their steps faltered as fear took hold. As they climbed a rocky ridge, Elena noticed something peculiar. The shadows cast by their dim flashlights didn't align with the light. They stretched and twisted unnaturally, some extending far beyond the source, while others moved in directions that defied logic. She blinked, convinced it was a trick of the mind, but the shadows persisted, writhing like living things. Her grip on her son tightened, and she murmured a silent prayer. At the crest of the ridge, the group paused to catch their breath. Below lay a desolate valley, its surface shimmering faintly in the moonlight. The guide surveyed the landscape, his jaw tightening. "We need to keep moving," he urged, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. As they descended, the whispers returned, louder this time, and with them came a sense of being watched. Elena glanced over her shoulder, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw movement, a figure darting between the rocks. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "What's wrong?" asked a man named Victor, one of the more vocal members of the group. Elena shook her head, unwilling to voice her fear. She didn't have to. Victor followed her gaze, and his face paled. "There's someone out there," he whispered. His words sent a ripple of panic through the group. El Coyote snapped at them to stay calm, but his own unease was palpable. The group pressed on, their pace quickening despite their exhaustion. But the whispers grew deafening, their words incomprehensible, yet filled with malice. A young woman at the back of the group suddenly screamed. "Something touched me," she cried, clutching her arm as if it burned. When the others turned to look, they saw no one behind them, only the endless expanse of the desert. El Coyote stopped abruptly, holding up his hand for silence. The group obeyed, their breath shallow and their eyes scanning the darkness. The whispers had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a low, guttural growl shattered the stillness. It was unlike anything they had ever heard, part animal, part human, and entirely unnatural. "We have to move. Now," El Coyote ordered, his voice trembling. The group needed no further encouragement. They stumbled forward, their fear fueling their steps. But as they hurried through the valley, the growl came again, closer this time. Elena's son whimpered, and she held him tighter, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. As they reached the other side of the valley, they found themselves at the edge of a dry riverbed. The ground was littered with bones, animal, they hoped, though some looked unsettlingly human. A cold wind swept through the area, carrying with it a stench of decay. "We shouldn't be here," Victor muttered, but there was no turning back. Behind them, the growl sounded once more, accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps, or perhaps hoofbeats. Elena glanced at her son, his wide eyes reflecting the fear she felt. She whispered another prayer, this time for protection. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had already crossed an invisible threshold, one where prayers held no power. The desert, vast and indifferent, had become a predator, and they were its prey. The group moved quickly, their collective fear transforming into a quiet urgency. The dry riverbed stretched endlessly in both directions, and the skeletal remains beneath their feet seemed to shift with each step, as though protesting their intrusion. El Coyote scanned the horizon, his flashlight flickering as if it too was succumbing to the desert's oppressive energy. No one spoke, the silence broken only by their hurried footsteps and the occasional whimper of Elena's son, who clung to her like a lifeline. As they pressed on, the riverbed narrowed, its rocky walls rising on either side. The whispers had returned, faint at first but growing louder with each passing minute. Unlike before, the voices now seemed to call specific names. Elena froze when she heard her own name whispered in the wind, followed by a voice she hadn't heard in years, her mother's. Menina, Vanessa, it said, soft and familiar, laced with a sweetness that didn't belong here. Elena's knees buckled, but Victor steadied her, his eyes wide with understanding. Don't listen to it, he said, his voice barely audible. It's not real. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if mocking Victor's assurance. Then, without warning, the group stumbled upon a man standing in the center of the riverbed. He was tall and gaunt, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat that cast a shadow even in the dim moonlight. His clothes were old and tattered, resembling those of a bygone era, and his hands were clasped around a wooden staff carved with strange symbols. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by an unnatural stillness that pressed on their ears like a weight. Queen Aries too? El Coyote demanded, his voice steady but his hand inching toward the knife at his belt. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying each of them in turn. His eyes, when they caught the light, gleamed unnaturally, their irises reflecting a pale, sickly green. You're far from where you should be, the man said finally, his voice deep and resonant, carrying an accent that none of them could place. We're just passing through, El Coyote said cautiously. The man let out a low chuckle, one that sent shivers down their spines. Passing through? He repeated, his tone mocking. This place isn't meant for passing through. It's meant for those who have something to pay. Victor stepped forward, his face defiant despite the fear that was evident in his trembling hands. We don't want trouble, he said. Let us go, and we won't bother you. The man's gaze snapped to Victor, and his smile widened, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. It's not about what you want, he said. It's about what you owe. Elena felt her son's small hand tighten around hers, and she instinctively pulled him closer. Please, she said, her voice cracking. We have nothing to give. The man turned his gaze to her, and for a moment, she thought she saw pity in his expression. Everyone has something to give, he said softly. The question is whether you'll give it willingly. Before anyone could respond, the man lifted his staff and struck it against the ground. The impact sent a ripple through the air, and the desert seemed to come alive around them. The walls of the riverbed shifted, their rocky surfaces sprouting jagged formations that looked like twisted faces frozen in silent screams. The bones beneath their feet rattled and began to sink into the ground, as though being swallowed whole. Choose, the man said, his voice echoing unnaturally. One of you stays. The rest may go. Panic erupted among the group. El Coyote drew his knife, but the man didn't flinch. Victor shouted, We're not leaving anyone behind. Others begged and pleaded, their voices blending into a cacophony of despair. Elena held her son tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers in a desperate attempt to shield him from the nightmare unfolding around them. The man raised his staff again, and the riverbed began to quake. Choose, he repeated, his voice booming, or I'll choose for you. The group fell silent, their fear palpable. El Coyote stepped forward, his expression grim. Take me, he said. Let them go. The man regarded him for a long moment before shaking his head. It's not your choice to make, he said. His gaze shifted to the rest of the group, lingering on each of them as though weighing their worth. Finally, his eyes settled on Elena's son. "The child," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Elena's heart stopped, and she instinctively stepped in front of her son. "No," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. The man's expression didn't change. "The child has the purest debt," he said. "A life untainted by regret. His offering will restore balance." El Coyote lunged at the man, his knife flashing in the moonlight. But before he could strike, the man raised his staff, and El Coyote was flung backward as though by an invisible force. He hit the ground hard, unconscious. The man turned back to the group. "The child," he said again, his voice colder than the desert night. Elena's legs gave out, and she fell to her knees, clutching her son as the others looked on in horrified silence. Before she could respond, a scream pierced the night, not from anyone in the group, but from somewhere deep in the desert. The man's head snapped toward the sound, his expression darkening. "You've lingered too long," he said, his voice now tinged with urgency. "Go, now, before it comes." Without another word, he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared, leaving the group paralyzed with fear as the distant scream grew louder. The scream carried through the desert, unnatural and elongated, as if it belonged to something that couldn't possibly exist. It was neither entirely human nor animal, high-pitched yet guttural, filled with malice. The group stood frozen, their breaths caught in their throats, unsure whether to run or remain still. The distant wail seemed to bounce off the narrow riverbed walls, growing louder and closer with each passing moment. Victor was the first to recover, grabbing Elena's arm and shouting, "We have to move!" The urgency in his voice snapped the others out of their paralysis. El Coyote, groaning as he regained consciousness, staggered to his feet and waved them forward. "No more stopping," he growled, his usual bravado shaken but not extinguished. "Stay close. Stay quiet." The group moved as one, clinging to the shadows cast by the rocky walls. Elena held her son tightly, murmuring soft reassurances into his ear even as her own heart thundered in her chest. Each step felt heavier, the air around them growing colder and thicker as if the desert itself was alive and suffocating them. The scream came again, louder this time and closer. It echoed in their ears, impossible to pinpoint, as though the sound originated from every direction at once. As they pressed forward, the landscape began to change. The ground beneath their feet shifted from dry, packed dirt to something slick and unrecognizable. In the dim moonlight, they could see patches of a strange, viscous substance coating the rocks and pooling in the crevices. The smell hit them next, a sickly sweet rot that made their stomachs churn. Elena gagged, covering her son's nose and mouth with her scarf, but the stench seemed to seep through everything. "What is this?" whispered Maria, her voice trembling. No one answered, though the question lingered in their minds. It was Victor who stopped suddenly, pointing ahead. "Look," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The group turned their eyes to where he was pointing. In the distance, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, was a structure. It rose from the desert floor like an ancient monolith, its jagged silhouette defying the natural geometry of the land. "It wasn't there before," El Coyote muttered, narrowing his eyes. "I know this route. There's nothing like that here." But there it stood, a towering, twisted amalgamation of metal and stone, its surface shimmering with the same viscous substance that coated the ground. It was covered in symbols that pulsed faintly, as if alive. The group hesitated, torn between the terror that drove them forward and the dread emanating from the strange structure. The scream came again, and this time it was close enough to rattle their very bones. A shadow passed across the moonlight, impossibly large and fleeting, disappearing behind the walls of the canyon. The group froze, their heads snapping upward in unison. "We need to keep moving," Victor said, his voice shaking but resolute. "Whatever that thing is, it's hunting us." They skirted the edge of the strange structure, keeping as far from it as the narrowing path allowed. The whispers had returned, louder now, overlapping and echoing, but there was something different about them. Instead of pleading or calling names, They now seemed to be chanting, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic cadence that matched the pulsing of the symbols on the structure. Elena clutched her son even tighter, his small body trembling against her. As they moved past the structure, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Maria stumbled, clutching her ears and screaming, "Make it stop," before collapsing to her knees. El Coyote turned back, grabbing her arm and hauling her to her feet. "Move," he barked, but it was too late. The shadow returned, this time descending from above. It landed with a sound that was both a roar and a sickening squelch. The group barely had time to register the creature's form, a grotesque mass of writhing tendrils, gleaming eyes, and an open maw that stretched too wide to be natural. It towered over them, its body shifting and undulating as if it were made of liquid shadows. Maria screamed again, and the creature lunged toward her, its tendrils reaching with horrifying speed. Without thinking, Victor shoved Maria out of the way and raised a rock, hurling it at the creature's face. The rock hit its mark, and the creature recoiled, letting out another ear-splitting shriek. "Run!" Victor yelled, his voice breaking. The group didn't need to be told twice. They bolted, Maria stumbling as she scrambled to her feet, tears streaming down her face. The creature didn't pursue immediately. Instead, it stood still, its many eyes blinking in unison as if assessing them. Then, as if satisfied, it began to move, its tendrils snaking across the ground with terrifying speed. The group ran blindly, the whispers and screams blending into a cacophony that seemed to come from inside their own heads. Finally, the path opened into a wider clearing. El Coyote stopped abruptly, holding up a hand to halt the others. "There," he said, pointing to a faint light in the distance. "That's the checkpoint. We're close." The group's relief was short-lived as the creature's shriek pierced the air once more, followed by the sound of its tendrils tearing through the rocky terrain. They had no choice but to keep running, their hope mingling with despair. The checkpoint loomed ahead, a fragile promise of safety in a nightmarish landscape. But as they drew closer, the group couldn't shake the feeling that the light ahead might not be salvation, but something far worse. The light ahead seemed to flicker with an unnatural rhythm, like the heartbeat of some malevolent entity. It grew brighter as the group approached, illuminating a crude structure that barely resembled the border checkpoint they had envisioned. The walls were patchwork, cobbled together from sheets of rusted metal and wooden planks splintered at the edges. Above the structure hung a single floodlight, swinging erratically from a pole that appeared on the verge of collapse. It was an eerie beacon, casting long, jagged shadows across the desert floor. Victor was the first to stop, panting heavily. "That's not the checkpoint," he said, his voice shaking. He turned to El Coyote, whose face betrayed an uncharacteristic uncertainty. "You've been here before. What is this?" Victor demanded. El Coyote shook his head, his bravado replaced by unease. "I don't know. This isn't supposed to be here. I've never seen it." His words only deepened the growing pit of dread in the group's stomachs. The structure, though still and silent, radiated a sense of wrongness, as if it were waiting for them to come closer. The creature's distant shrieks echoed through the canyon, snapping them out of their hesitation. "We don't have a choice," Maria said, her voice trembling but determined. "We can't go back. We have to keep moving." Elena, clutching her son tightly, nodded in agreement. Without further discussion, they pressed forward toward the ominous light. As they approached, the structure's details came into sharper focus. The walls were smeared with handprints, streaked in dark, crusted stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Symbols, similar to those on the strange monolith they had passed, were etched into the wood, glowing faintly as if alive. The floodlight overhead buzzed and flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow on the dirt below. When they reached the entrance, a door creaked open as if by invitation. The sound reverberated unnaturally, lasting far longer than it should have. The group hesitated on the threshold, their instincts screaming to turn back, but the ever-approaching shrieks of the creature gave them no such luxury. Victor steeled himself, and stepped inside, followed by the others. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the scent of rot and mildew. The walls were lined with shelves, each crammed with jars of murky liquid containing indistinct, misshapen objects. A desk sat at the center of the room, its surface covered in papers scrawled with illegible writing and more glowing symbols. Behind it, a single chair faced away from them, as if waiting for someone or something to sit. "What is this place?" whispered Maria, her voice barely audible. El Coyote approached the desk cautiously, his eyes darting between the jars and the shadows pooling in the corners. He reached for one of the papers, but the moment his fingers touched it, a loud bang resounded from the back of the structure. Everyone jumped, their hearts racing. Before they could react, the floodlight outside flickered violently and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Elena let out a gasp, clutching her son even tighter. "Stay close." Victor barked, fumbling for his flashlight. When he turned it on, the beam wavered and dimmed, as though the light itself was being consumed by the oppressive darkness. The banging grew louder, now accompanied by scraping sounds, as if something massive was trying to force its way in. "It's here," El Coyote muttered, backing away from the desk. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. Suddenly, the chair behind the desk began to move. It spun slowly, revealing a figure slumped in it. At first, they thought it was a corpse. Its skin was gray and desiccated, its eyes sunken into its skull. But then it moved, its head jerking upward to reveal milky, unseeing eyes. A wide, unnatural grin spread across its face, and a voice echoed through the room. Not from the figure's mouth, but from all around them. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, the tone mocking and hollow. The group froze, unable to look away from the horrifying figure. Its grin widened unnaturally, stretching its face to the point of tearing. The banging at the back of the structure ceased abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. The figure's eyes flicked to Elena's son, its grin faltering for the first time. "He doesn't belong," it said, its voice a low growl now. "You've brought him here, and now we are awake. What does that mean?" Elena screamed, stepping back. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by her fear. "You'll see," it whispered, before collapsing into itself, crumbling into a pile of ash and dust. At the same moment, the banging resumed, louder and more frantic than before. The walls of the structure began to shake, and the symbols on them flared with blinding light. "Run!" El Coyote shouted, shoving the door open. The group spilled out into the night, stumbling over the uneven ground. Behind them, the structure began to implode, folding inward with a deafening roar. The glowing symbols burst into flames, and the air was filled with the stench of burning flesh. The group didn't stop running until they were far enough away to see the structure reduced to smoldering rubble. But even from the distance, they could hear faint whispers carried on the wind, taunting them with words they couldn't quite make out. And just beyond the rubble, the creature's shadow loomed, its many eyes glinting in the darkness. The group stumbled through the desert, their steps uneven and their breath ragged. The light from the destroyed structure behind them faded into the horizon, leaving the stars as their only illumination. Silence enveloped them, save for the occasional murmur of the wind, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the kind that felt heavy, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Victor took the lead, his flashlight flickering but still functional. Elena clung to her son, her knuckles white as she whispered reassurances to him that even she didn't believe. Maria kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes searching the darkness for movement, while El Coyote trudged forward, his earlier bravado now replaced by grim determination. After what felt like hours, they came upon an oasis, shimmering like a mirage against the stark desert landscape. The sight was so unexpected and surreal that for a moment they all stopped. A pool of water glistened under the moonlight, surrounded by lush greenery that seemed untouched by the arid wasteland around it. A small hut stood nearby, with smoke curling lazily from its chimney, as though inviting them in. "This has to be another trick," Maria said, her voice quivering. It can't be real. Victor hesitated, but then turned to the group. We don't have a choice. We need water, and we need rest. If it's a trick, we'll deal with it. His words were resolute, but his expression betrayed his own doubts. As they approached, the air seemed to change. It grew cooler, less oppressive, and the faint sound of water trickling into the pool reached their ears. The hut's door opened as they neared, and a woman stepped out. She was older, with silver hair that cascaded down her back, and her face was lined with age but radiated warmth. "Travelers," she said, her voice smooth and calming. "You look like you've been through hell. Come, rest. There's food and water inside." The group exchanged wary glances. "Who are you?" Victor asked, his tone cautious. "I'm just a caretaker," the woman replied with a gentle smile. "This place, it's for those who've lost their way." She gestured toward the hut. "Please, you'll be safe here." Despite their reservations, the group entered. The inside of the hut was small but cozy, with a fire crackling in a stone hearth. A table was set with bowls of stew and fresh bread, and a pitcher of water gleamed enticingly. The woman guided them to sit, her movements almost hypnotic in their grace. As they ate, their bodies relaxed, the tension of the past few hours melting away. The water was cool and refreshing, and the stew was rich and flavorful. For the first time since their journey began, they felt safe, or so they thought. Victor, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly dropped his spoon. His eyes widened, and his face contorted in pain. "What's happening?" he gasped, clutching his stomach. Before anyone could react, he collapsed onto the table, his breathing ragged. El Coyote leaped to his feet, his instincts taking over. "What did you do to him?" he demanded, his voice a snarl. The woman's expression remained serene, but there was an edge to her smile now, something darker. "I only gave him what he needed," she said softly. "What all of you need, to see the truth." Victor's body convulsed, and his eyes rolled back in his head. When they fluttered open again, they weren't his eyes anymore. They were black, endless voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. He sat up slowly, his movements unnatural, as though controlled by unseen strings. "You've brought him here," Victor said, but it wasn't his voice. It was layered, a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from every corner of the room. "You've opened the door?" The group backed away, terror gripping them. Elena clutched her son, her eyes wide with horror. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" she cried. The woman tilted her head, watching the scene unfold with an almost maternal patience. "This land remembers," she said cryptically, "and it doesn't forgive." Before anyone could respond, Victor, or the thing inside him, rose to his feet. The shadows in the room deepened, stretching and writhing like living things. The hut itself seemed to shudder, the walls creaking as though they might collapse at any moment. "You cannot run," the voice in Victor said, its tone both a warning and a taunt. "You cannot hide. The desert sees all, and it will have its due." El Coyote grabbed Elena and Maria, dragging them toward the door. "We have to go now," he shouted. But as they fled, the woman's voice followed them, echoing in their minds. "You've only delayed the inevitable," she said, her tone almost pitying. When they stumbled back into the night, the oasis was gone. The hut, the pool, the greenery, all of it had vanished, leaving only an empty expanse of sand. But the whispers remained, carried on the wind, reminding them that whatever they had awakened was far from finished. The desert felt different now, heavier somehow, as though the land itself had become an accomplice to their terror. The group moved in silence, their breaths shallow and quick, their footsteps unsteady against the ever-shifting sand. The stars overhead were bright, but they offered no comfort. If anything, they seemed to watch with a detached cruelty, their cold light illuminating the hopelessness of their flight. Elena clutched her son, her lips moving in silent prayer. Her steps faltered, but she forced herself forward, driven by the primal need to protect her child. Maria kept glancing over her shoulder, the image of Victor's hollow, black eyes etched into her mind. El Coyote walked ahead, his movements purposeful but strained. He was no longer the confident guide they had met at the start of this journey. Now, he was a man weighed down by fear. "Where are we going?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't expect an answer, but the silence was unbearable. "Away," El Coyote replied curtly, not looking back. "Just away from that place." The wind picked up, carrying with it a low, almost imperceptible hum. It was a sound that wasn't quite natural. Part wind, part whisper, part something unnameable. It brushed against their ears like ghostly fingers, and with every gust, it grew louder, more insistent. Maria stopped abruptly, grabbing El Coyote's arm. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We all hear it," he replied, his jaw tightening. "Keep moving." But the sound was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just noise. It was a presence, wrapping itself around them, burrowing into their minds. Elena stumbled, her legs giving out as the whispers seemed to grow louder in her head. "They're saying his name," she muttered, clutching her son tightly. Her voice was tinged with hysteria. "Victor! They're calling for Victor." El Coyote bent down, pulling Elena back to her feet. "It's not real," he said firmly, though his own voice betrayed his doubt. "None of this is real." As if in response, the desert seemed to shift around them. The sand beneath their feet trembled, and in the distance, dark shapes began to emerge. At first, they looked like nothing more than shadows cast by the moonlight, but as they drew closer, their forms became clearer. They were humanoid, but their features were distorted, elongated in unnatural ways. Their movements were jerky, like puppets controlled by an unskilled hand. Maria gasped, pointing at the figures. "What are those?" she whispered, her voice thick with panic. "They're not alive," El Coyote said, his tone flat. "That's all that matters. Keep moving." But the figures didn't stay distant for long. They began to close in, their movements gaining purpose and speed. The whispers grew deafening, filling the air with a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The words were unintelligible, but the malice behind them was unmistakable. "Run!" El Coyote shouted, shoving Maria forward. The group broke into a sprint, their feet slipping and sinking into the treacherous sand. Elena struggled to keep up, her son's weight making every step a Herculean effort. Maria grabbed her arm, half pulling, half dragging her along. The shadows gave chase, their movements inhumanly fast despite their awkward gait. Their limbs stretched and twisted as they ran, their dark forms blending into the night before reappearing closer each time. One of them let out a guttural sound, something between a growl and a scream, and it sent a wave of icy fear through the group. El Coyote pulled a knife from his belt, though it looked pitifully small against the looming threat. "Keep going," he yelled, turning to face the approaching figures. Maria hesitated, but Elena shoved her forward. "Go! He'll catch up," she cried, though her voice was thick with desperation. They didn't see what happened next, but they heard it. The sound of metal meeting flesh, the unnatural screeches of the shadows, and then silence. Maria glanced back, but El Coyote was gone. There was no sign of him, no trace of the struggle, only the empty desert stretching endlessly behind them. The two women pushed onward, their lungs burning and their legs screaming for rest. Elena's son whimpered in her arms, his small body trembling. The whispers had quieted now, replaced by an eerie stillness that was somehow worse. As the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, they saw it, a cluster of buildings in the distance, hazy but unmistakable. A town. Hope flickered briefly in their hearts, but it was fragile enough to be shattered by the echoes of a familiar voice. It was Victor's voice, calling out to them from somewhere behind. "Wait for me," he shouted, his tone cheerful, almost playful. But when they turned to look, the sun illuminated a figure that wasn't quite him. His eyes still glowed black, and his smile stretched too wide, too unnatural. He waved at them, his movements eerily deliberate. "Wait for me," he called again, his voice now layered with that same chorus of whispers. Maria grabbed Elena's hand, and together they ran toward the town, knowing full well that whatever awaited them, there might be no safer than the horrors behind them. The desert was no longer just a place. It was alive, and it had marked them as its prey. The town on the horizon emerged slowly, as if reluctant to reveal itself. Its edges wavered in the dawn light, the mirage-like shimmer making Maria and Elena question whether it was real. The structures were squat and weathered, their surfaces cracked by time and heat. A large, faded sign at the outskirts welcomed them, Bienvenidos a la Soledad. Below it, graffiti scrawled in red, Nadie sale vivo. No one leaves alive. The women slowed their pace as they entered the town. Their breaths came in shallow gasps, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and fear. The place was eerily still. No sound of birds, no rustling of wind through trees, just silence, so complete it felt unnatural. The streets were deserted, the windows of the adobe buildings staring back at them like hollow eyes. Elena clutched her son tightly, her gaze darting nervously from shadow to shadow. There has to be someone here, she murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. She looked to Maria, who remained silent, her face drawn and pale. The first few buildings they passed were abandoned shops, their doors ajar and interiors coated in dust. A broken mannequin lay face down in the rubble of what was once a clothing store, its lifeless form unsettlingly human in the dim light. Maria peered inside but quickly turned away, her heart pounding. Every corner seemed to hold the weight of unseen eyes. Over there, Elena whispered, pointing to a small church at the center of the town square. Its white facade was chipped and discolored, but the wooden cross atop it stood tall, defiant against the decay around it. Maybe someone's inside. They hurried toward the church, their footsteps echoing eerily in the empty streets. As they reached the doors, Maria hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong, though she couldn't say why. The air around it was heavy, charged, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Elena, too desperate to care, pushed the doors open. They creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the empty square. Inside, the church was dimly lit by stained glass windows, the colored light casting strange patterns on the worn pews. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. At the front of the church stood a statue of the Virgin Mary, her face serene, but her eyes unsettlingly lifelike. The statue's hands were clasped in prayer, but something about the way they were positioned seemed off. Maria couldn't put her finger on it, but it sent a chill down her spine. "There's no one here," Elena said, her voice trembling. She sank onto one of the pews, her son cradled in her arms. "What do we do now?" Maria didn't answer. She was drawn to the altar, where a large, leather-bound book lay open. Its pages were yellowed with age, the text written in an unfamiliar script that seemed to shift and change as she looked at it. Her fingers itched to touch it, but a deep, instinctual fear kept her rooted to the spot. "Elena," Maria called softly, her voice echoing in the silence. "I think this place is—" A loud thud interrupted her, coming from somewhere deep within the church. Both women froze, their eyes wide with terror. Another thud followed, then another, each one closer than the last. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, like footsteps echoing in a cavernous space. Maria backed away from the altar, her heart racing. "We need to leave," she whispered urgently. Elena stood, clutching her son, her face pale with fear. Before they could move, the doors of the church slammed shut, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. The stained glass windows darkened, the light dimming until the room was bathed in an oppressive twilight. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the sudden chill. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was the same sound they had heard in the desert, but now it was louder, more distinct. Words began to form, incomprehensible yet unmistakably malicious. The Virgin Mary statue began to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, its head turned toward them, the serene expression twisting into something cruel and mocking. The clasped hands opened, revealing long, claw-like fingers that dripped with a dark, viscous liquid. Its eyes, so lifelike before, now glowed with an otherworldly light. Maria grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her toward the door. "Run," she shouted, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. But the doors wouldn't budge, no matter how hard they pushed. The whispers grew louder, the walls vibrating with their intensity. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the church as one of the pews toppled over, the force sending splinters flying. From the shadows near the altar, a figure began to emerge, its shape indistinct but undeniably menacing. Its presence filled the room with a suffocating dread, its form twisting and shifting like smoke caught in a windstorm. "We have to find another way out," Maria screamed, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. She spotted a side door near the front of the church and pointed to it. "There! Go!" Elena didn't hesitate, holding her son tightly. She ran toward the door, Maria close behind. The whispers followed them, growing louder, angrier, as if the church itself was alive and unwilling to let them go. When they burst through the side door, they found themselves in an overgrown courtyard, the dawn light barely breaking through the thick canopy of dead trees. The air was cold and damp, and the silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise they had just escaped. They didn't stop to catch their breath. Without speaking, they fled into the shadows, their only thought to put as much distance as possible between themselves and La Soledad. But as they ran, a single, horrifying realization settled over them like a shroud. They hadn't escaped anything. The town, the desert, the whispers, everything was connected. And whatever force had claimed Victor was not done with them yet. The overgrown courtyard was both a refuge and a maze, its walls of tangled vines and jagged branches pressing in on Maria and Elena as they ran. The oppressive silence had returned, but it was no comfort. Every step through the underbrush felt like stepping into the unknown, and every shadow seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the right moment to strike. Maria led the way, her heart pounding in her chest as she searched for an exit. The side door they had burst through was now gone, replaced by a wall of ivy so dense it looked impenetrable. It was as though the courtyard had rearranged itself, trapping them in a labyrinth designed to confuse and isolate. "We're going in circles," Elena whispered, her voice shaking. She clutched her son tightly, his small face buried against her shoulder. "I swear I've seen that tree before." Maria glanced at the gnarled tree Elena was pointing to. Its twisted trunk was scarred with deep grooves, and its branches hung low like skeletal arms. It was unmistakable. They had passed it before. Yet the path they had taken was straight, without a single turn. "It's playing with us," Maria said, her voice grim. "This place isn't natural. We need to keep moving." Elena hesitated, glancing back toward the church they had fled. The structure loomed over the courtyard like a silent sentinel, its spire disappearing into the gray sky. The stained glass windows, dark and lifeless when they had left, now glowed faintly, as though the building itself were watching them. "Maria," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we can't get out?" Maria didn't respond. She couldn't afford to entertain the possibility that they were truly trapped. Instead, she grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her forward, forcing her to move. The ground beneath them was uneven, littered with roots and stones that threatened to trip them with every step. As they pressed on, the air grew colder, each breath forming a cloud of vapor that quickly dissipated. The silence was broken by a faint, rhythmic sound, a low, hollow tapping that seemed to echo from all directions. At first, it was barely audible, like a distant drumbeat. But as they continued, it grew louder, more insistent, until it was impossible to ignore. "What is that?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. She clutched her son even tighter, her knuckles white with fear. Maria stopped, listening intently. The sound wasn't coming from any one direction. It surrounded them, enveloping them like a shroud. It was a pattern, deliberate and precise, like the ticking of a clock or the beating of a heart. She scanned the shadows, her eyes darting from one corner of the courtyard to another. Then she saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a ripple in the air that seemed out of place. But as she stared, the flicker took shape, solidifying into a figure. It was tall and thin, its body wrapped in a tattered cloak that billowed as though caught in an unseen wind. Its face was obscured, but its presence was undeniable, a dark void that seemed to absorb all light around it. "Run," Maria said, her voice barely audible. She grabbed Elena's arm again, pulling her toward a narrow path that seemed to lead away from the figure. But as they moved, the figure began to follow, its movements slow but deliberate. The tapping sound grew louder with each step it took, the rhythm matching the pounding of their hearts. The path twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the maze of the courtyard. The figure followed, always just behind them, its presence a constant weight on their shoulders. No matter how fast they ran, the distance between them never seemed to grow. Finally, they burst into a small clearing, the sudden openness a jarring contrast to the enclosed paths they had been navigating. At the center of the clearing stood a well, its stone walls crumbling with age. The tapping sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that made their ears ring. Maria approached the well cautiously, her eyes fixed on the dark opening at its center. Something about it felt wrong, but she couldn't look away. The air around it was thick and heavy, and a faint, acrid smell wafted up from its depths. "What is it?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maria shook her head, unable to answer. She leaned over the edge of the well, peering into the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just an empty void that seemed to stretch on forever. But then, deep within the darkness, something moved. It was subtle at first, a ripple that could have been her imagination. But as she stared, the movement became more pronounced, a writhing mass that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The acrid smell grew stronger, burning her nostrils and making her eyes water. "Maria, step back," Elena said, her voice urgent. She pulled at Maria's arm, trying to drag her away from the well. But Maria didn't move. She was transfixed, her mind racing with questions she couldn't articulate. Then the mass in the well surged upward, a dark, churning force that seemed to defy the laws of nature. It rose higher and higher, until it was level with the edge of the well. The tapping sound returned, louder and faster than ever, echoing through the clearing like a heartbeat. Maria stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure that had been following them stepped into the clearing, its presence a suffocating weight that made the air itself feel thick and heavy. The dark mass from the well began to take shape, coalescing into something that was neither man nor beast. Maria and Elena stood frozen, their minds screaming for them to run, but their bodies refusing to obey. Whatever this was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to let them go. The clearing around the ancient well held a silence that felt alive, pulsating with an unseen energy. Maria's legs trembled as she backed away, her eyes darting between the figure cloaked in shadow and the unnatural mass surging from the well. Each seemed to compete for dominance, their presence pressing down on the fragile remnants of logic she clung to. The oppressive rhythm of the tapping sound reverberated through the air, amplifying the terror coursing through her veins. Elena's grip tightened on her son, who clung to her neck with silent, wide-eyed terror. She whispered a prayer under her breath, her voice quivering with desperation. The words were nearly inaudible, but Maria caught fragments. Pleas for protection, for salvation, for this to end. The boy whimpered softly, his small hands trembling as they clutched his mother's shoulder. Maria tried to steady her breathing, forcing herself to assess their situation. The shadowy figure remained at the edge of the clearing, motionless but unnervingly present. The writhing mass from the well had stilled, its surface rippling like liquid obsidian. For a fleeting moment, Maria wondered if they were caught in some twisted standoff between two forces she couldn't begin to comprehend. "Don't look at it," she whispered to Elena, her voice hoarse. "Don't focus on either of them. Just move." Elena nodded, her face pale as she began to inch toward the far edge of the clearing. The boy made a muffled sound, but she hushed him gently, her eyes darting between Maria and the entities that surrounded them. Maria followed, her body tense, every muscle coiled for flight. As they neared the edge of the clearing, the tapping sound shifted. It grew erratic, no longer a steady rhythm, but a chaotic cascade of beats that seemed to echo from within the well itself. The dark mass surged again, its shape shifting violently, as though in response to their movement. Maria froze, her instincts screaming that any sudden motion would draw its wrath. "What do you want?" she blurted, her voice louder than she intended. The words felt foolish as soon as they left her mouth, but she couldn't stop herself. "Why are you doing this to us?" The shadowy figure tilted its head, a gesture that seemed almost curious. It took a single step forward, and the ground beneath them seemed to shudder. The well emitted a low, guttural sound, like a deep groan of protest. Maria's stomach churned as the acrid smell intensified, filling the air with a stench so vile it made her gag. Elena whimpered, clutching her son tighter. "Maria, stop," she whispered. "Don't speak to it. Don't." Before she could finish, the figure raised one arm, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to stretch time itself. From within the folds of its cloak, a faint light began to glow, pale and flickering like a dying flame. The light grew brighter, illuminating the clearing in an eerie, otherworldly hue. Shadows danced across the ground, twisting and contorting as though alive. The light's brilliance revealed something horrifying, symbols etched into the stones surrounding the well. They glowed faintly, their lines sharp and jagged, forming patterns that defied comprehension. Maria felt her head throb as she stared at them, her vision swimming as though the symbols were pulling her mind into their depths. "Elena, don't look," she shouted, tearing her gaze away. She grabbed Elena's arm, forcing her to move. But the light followed them, its glow intensifying as the shadowy figure took another step forward. The air grew thick, vibrating with an energy that seemed to seep into their very bones. Maria felt an overwhelming urge to drop to her knees, to surrender to whatever force was bearing down on them. She clenched her fists, digging her nails into her palms to ground herself. "We can't stop," she muttered, more to herself than Elena. "We have to keep going." They broke into a run, darting into the dense foliage at the edge of the clearing. The moment they crossed the threshold, the tapping sound ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. The light from the clearing dimmed behind them, but Maria didn't dare look back. She focused on the path ahead, the uneven ground threatening to trip them with every step. Branches scratched at their arms and faces as they pushed forward, the forest growing darker with each passing moment. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted limbs forming a canopy so thick that no light could penetrate. Maria's breaths came in ragged gasps, but she refused to slow down. Finally, they stumbled into another clearing, smaller and less foreboding than the one they had fled. The air here was cooler, and the oppressive weight they had felt before seemed to lift slightly. Maria collapsed to her knees, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Elena sank to the ground beside her, clutching her son tightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the boy's quiet sobbing, muffled against his mother's shoulder. Maria looked up at the sky, searching for any sign of normalcy, but the clouds above were dark and churning, offering no solace. "What is happening to us?" Elena finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maria shook her head, her mind racing. She didn't have an answer, but one thing was certain. Whatever forces were at play, they weren't done with them yet. The clearing they found offered only a fleeting sense of reprieve, a fragile illusion of safety in the chaos that consumed them. The dense canopy overhead shivered in an unseen breeze, whispering faintly in a language Maria could not understand. Elena sat against a tree, clutching her son as though he were the only anchor in a world untethered. Her whispers of comfort mixed with his muffled sobs, creating a strange, haunting melody that resonated through the space. Maria scanned their surroundings, every muscle in her body taut with vigilance. The oppressive energy from the ancient well had not followed them here, but its presence lingered in her mind, a stain she could not erase. She rubbed her temples, trying to dispel the throbbing pain that had taken root since she saw the symbols. They burned behind her eyelids whenever she blinked, their jagged forms seared into her memory. "We can't stay here long," Maria said, her voice hoarse and strained. "Whatever is out there, it's not going to stop." Elena lifted her head, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Where do we go? There's no road, no sign of anything normal. We're just wandering in circles." Before Maria could respond, the boy shifted in his mother's lap. His small hand pointed toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew in thick, gnarled clusters. "The voices," he whispered. "They're calling." Elena froze, her arms tightening instinctively around him. "What voices?" she asked, her tone sharp with fear. He didn't answer, but his eyes remained fixed on the dark forest. Maria followed his gaze, straining her ears. At first, she heard nothing but the soft rustle of leaves. But as the seconds ticked by, a faint murmur reached her, a series of hushed tones, rhythmic and unsettling. The voices rose and fell like a distant tide, their cadence hypnotic and otherworldly. "Do you hear that?" Maria asked, glancing at Elena. The other woman nodded, her face pale as ash. The boy slid from Elena's lap and began walking toward the sound. Elena lunged forward, grabbing his arm, but he didn't resist. Instead, he turned to her with an unnerving calmness that sent a chill down Maria's spine. "They know the way out," he said simply, as though it were a fact beyond question. "Out of where?" Maria demanded, stepping closer. Her voice wavered, betraying the fear she tried to suppress. "Do you even know what you're talking about?" The boy didn't respond. His eyes held a faraway look, as though he were gazing through the trees into some hidden dimension. Maria glanced at Elena, who seemed paralyzed, torn between her maternal instinct to protect her son and the eerie conviction in his words. "We can't trust this," Maria said firmly, grabbing the boy's other arm. "This place, whatever it is, it's manipulating him. It's—" Before she could finish, the murmuring voices grew louder, their tones shifting from whispers to an almost melodic chant. The sound enveloped the clearing, pressing against Maria's skull with an intensity that made her wince. The symbols from the well flashed in her mind again, and she stumbled back, clutching her head. "Stop it," she screamed, though she wasn't sure who or what she was yelling at. "Get out of my head!" The chanting stopped abruptly, plunging the clearing into an unnatural silence. The boy stared at Maria, his expression unchanging, but his eyes were different. They gleamed with a faint, silver light, as though reflecting a distant star. He tilted his head, studying her with a curiosity that seemed far too old for his small frame. "They've been waiting for you," he said, his voice layered with an unsettling duality, his own and something else. Something ancient. "You shouldn't have come here, but now you must finish what they started." Maria's breath caught in her throat. "Who? Who's waiting?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he turned back toward the forest, his small hand slipping from Elena's grasp. This time, neither woman moved to stop him. The air around them grew heavier, thick with a sense of inevitability. Maria exchanged a glance with Elena, whose face was a mask of terror and resignation. "What do we do?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Maria didn't have an answer. Her legs moved before her mind caught up, following the boy into the dense, shadowy woods. Elena hesitated for only a moment before trailing behind. The voices returned, fainter now but persistent, drawing them deeper into the labyrinth of trees. As they walked, the forest seemed to shift around them, the paths twisting and turning in impossible ways. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though no eyes met hers when she glanced over her shoulder. The symbols burned brighter in her mind, guiding her steps even as her heart screamed for her to turn back. They reached another clearing, smaller than the last but somehow more oppressive. In its center stood a stone altar, weathered and covered in moss. The boy approached it with purpose, his tiny hands brushing against its surface as though he'd seen it 1,000 times before. "This is where it begins," he said, his voice carrying an unnatural authority. "This is where you decide." Maria and Elena exchanged a look, their breath shallow and their hearts pounding. Neither understood what the boy meant, but both knew there was no turning back now. The stone altar loomed before them, a silent testament to some long-forgotten ritual. The moss that covered its surface seemed alive, pulsing gently as though the stone itself were breathing. Maria's heart raced as she took a cautious step forward, drawn to it despite every fiber of her being screaming for her to flee. The boy had stopped moving, his small hands still resting against the altar as his eyes glazed over. Elena's breath hitched beside her, but Maria could not bring herself to speak. "This is madness," Elena whispered, her voice cracking as she clutched her son's trembling body closer. The boy no longer seemed to notice her presence, his gaze fixed on something unseen, something beyond the forest, beyond the altar. It was as though his mind had already crossed into another world entirely, leaving his physical form behind. Maria stepped closer to the altar, her feet sinking into the earth as though the very ground was resisting her approach. The air around them felt thick, like the weight of centuries pressing down on her shoulders. She was acutely aware of the boy's words, his eerie proclamation that this is where you decide. What was she supposed to decide? And who had left such an ancient marker in this forsaken place? The sounds of the forest had become distant, muffled as if the very air had been smothered. Only the faint rustling of leaves underfoot and the rhythmic pulse from the altar filled the space. Maria glanced down at the altar surface, where intricate carvings, similar to the one she'd seen near the well, etched themselves into her vision. The symbols seemed to pulse in time with a rhythmic beat from the stone, a slow, deliberate cadence that tugged at her consciousness, as if urging her to understand something deep and primal. Without warning, the boy spoke again. His voice was not his own, not fully. It was layered with something ancient and dark, something that rattled her very bones. "The veil is thin now. The time has come." The words didn't fully register at first. Maria blinked and looked around, her pulse quickening. The air seemed to tremble as if a barrier between this world and another was weakening, becoming fragile, ready to shatter. She could feel it, too, a sensation of crossing some invisible threshold. The forest had begun to grow darker, the trees more twisted, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, reaching for her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "What veil?" Maria's voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the heavy silence that had fallen over the clearing. Elena stood frozen, her eyes wide in terror as she watched the boy, her mouth agape. The boy's eyes were glowing now, that unnatural, silvery light flickering like a beacon in the dark. "The veil between worlds," the boy repeated, his voice rising with a strange, otherworldly resonance. "The time is almost here. What has been waiting for you will come." Maria's mind spun. She could barely keep track of the strange words spilling from the boy's mouth, but she understood the gravity of the situation now. There was something coming, something that had been waiting. She had walked into this place unknowingly, unwittingly tied to whatever ancient forces lay beneath the forest's roots. A low rumble vibrated through the ground, faint at first, but steadily growing louder. The boy began to move again, his eyes never leaving the altar. His small fingers traced the carvings with a precision that made Maria's breath catch. He spoke once more, but this time his words were not meant for her. They were a chant, an invocation that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of the world itself. The air grew colder, sharp and biting, sending shivers down Maria's spine. Her eyes flickered to Elena, who was backing away slowly, clutching her son to her chest. Elena's face was pale, her lips trembling as she fought to remain calm. "Maria, we need to leave," Elena pleaded, her voice shaking. "This place, this isn't real. It's not real." But Maria couldn't tear her gaze away from the altar. The boy's chant intensified, his voice rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to draw power from the very earth beneath them. The forest itself seemed to bend and sway, as though something invisible were pushing against it. Maria's chest tightened, the pressure building as the air grew heavier. And then it happened. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, wide fissures splitting the earth in violent gashes. The trees groaned, their branches twisting like skeletal arms, reaching out to pull them into the depths of the earth. Maria stumbled backward, heart pounding, as something emerged from the cracked ground. Dark tendrils, slick and black, shot upward, reaching for the sky as if they were drawing something from the abyss itself. The chanting stopped abruptly. The boy stood motionless, his head tilted back as if in reverence to something unseen, something incomprehensible to the human mind. The dark tendrils reached toward the clearing, their ends crackling with a sinister energy. The sound of whispering voices flooded Maria's mind. Thousands of voices, speaking in tongues she could not understand, but the meaning was clear. They were calling, they were awakening. Maria's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to her knees, her vision blurring as the tendrils twisted and spiraled into the air. The world seemed to distort around her, the trees bending unnaturally, the sky darkening as if the sun itself had fled from this nightmare. The boy turned to face her, his expression no longer innocent, no longer childlike. His eyes glowed fiercely now, burning with the light of some unfathomable force. "You have come too far," he intoned, "and now the veil is gone. There is no escape." Maria's throat tightened, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The boy's words echoed in her mind, and she understood. There was no escape. Not anymore. The boundary between worlds had collapsed, and whatever had been waiting for them had been freed. She had made a decision when she stepped into this forest. But now, as the very fabric of reality seemed to tear around her, she understood how costly that decision had been. There was no turning back. Maria's heart thundered in her chest, a deafening pulse that seemed to echo through her entire body. The world around her had shifted, transformed into something unrecognizable. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt earth and decay, and the once vibrant forest had withered into a twisted mockery of itself. The trees now loomed like grotesque statues, their limbs gnarled and reaching as if trying to ensnare her in their embrace. The sky above was a deep shade of crimson, casting an unsettling light that made her skin crawl. And then there were the voices, whispers that buzzed in her mind, indistinct but filled with a chilling urgency. The boy, still standing before the altar, seemed oblivious to the world crumbling around them. His eyes, those bright, glowing orbs, were fixed on something beyond the physical realm. Maria followed his gaze, but saw nothing. There was only a void, a dark abyss that threatened to consume everything. The ground beneath them had become unstable, fissures splitting open like the earth itself was being torn apart. "Elena!" Maria shouted, her voice shaking. "We have to get out of here." But Elena was still frozen, her face ashen, her eyes wide with terror as she clutched her son to her chest. She barely seemed to hear Maria's frantic plea, her gaze locked on the boy, as though she too could sense the forces at work around them. Maria felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be closing in on her, circling her thoughts like a swarm of insects. She tried to push them out of her mind, but the words, though unintelligible, began to form a pattern, a rhythm that she could almost understand. It was as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling, and the voices were the threads of a tapestry being ripped apart. The tendrils that had erupted from the earth continued to writhe, their dark forms twisting and contorting with an unnatural grace. They reached for the sky, for the stars, for something beyond this world. But Maria's attention was drawn back to the boy. His face was eerily serene, his lips barely moving as he whispered something under his breath. The chant was not in any language she recognized, but it resonated deep within her chest. The boy wasn't just speaking to the altar anymore. He was calling to something beyond the veil. "Please," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is happening? What have we done?" She was shaking, her son's small body trembling in her arms, but there was no answer. The boy had stopped moving entirely, his body rigid, as if locked in some kind of trance. Maria's mind raced. There had been warnings, the strange symbols, the boy's cryptic words, the strange sense of dread that had settled over her the moment they set foot in this forsaken forest. She had dismissed them all, thinking they were just the product of an overactive imagination. But now, as the earth itself seemed to scream in pain, she realized how wrong she had been. They were part of something much larger, something ancient and beyond their comprehension. The altar was not just a relic. It was a conduit, a doorway, and the boy, he had become the key. The whispers were deafening now, crashing over her like a wave. She fell to her knees, clutching her head in an attempt to block them out. But it was useless. The voices were everywhere. They were inside her, their words twisting her thoughts, their demands clouding her vision. It was as if someone was pushing through the veil. Someone or something that had been waiting for this moment. "Elena, we have to do something," Maria gasped, her voice hoarse as she looked to her friend for help. But Elena was beyond hearing her. The once proud mother was now hunched over, her face twisted in agony as she rocked back and forth, muttering words that Maria could not understand. The boy, still standing at the altar, continued his chant, oblivious to the world around him. The air seemed to grow heavier, suffocating, and Maria could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest. The tendrils that had emerged from the earth were now curling around the altar, their dark forms coiling like serpents. The ground began to rumble again, the cracks widening, threatening to swallow them whole. Maria knew they were running out of time, but as the tremors shook the ground beneath them, something unexpected happened. The boy's eyes snapped open, and for the briefest moment, Maria saw a flicker of recognition in them. But it was fleeting. His gaze shifted, locking onto hers, and in that instant, she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It was as if he was no longer the child she had seen when they first entered the forest. There was something different about him now, something far darker. "You shouldn't have come," the boy whispered, his voice no longer his own. It was low, guttural, and filled with an unnatural authority. "You're too late." Maria's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to comprehend the words that had just escaped his lips. And then the ground beneath her feet shifted again, violently. The altar began to glow, an eerie, otherworldly light that poured from the cracks in the stone. It was blinding, and Maria had no choice but to shield her eyes. When the light faded, the forest around them had changed once again. The twisted trees, the decaying plants, the shifting shadows, everything was gone. In its place was a vast, empty plain, stretching out as far as the eye could see. The sky above was a pale, sickly hue, and the air felt thin, like the very atmosphere had been drained of life. It was as if they had stepped into another world entirely. And then she heard it, a sound that made her stomach turn. It was distant at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, marching in unison, approaching them from every direction. Maria's heart stopped. She had crossed the threshold, and there was no turning back. The veil had been torn, and whatever had been waiting on the other side was now free to roam. The unseen hand had claimed them. As the shadows of countless footsteps approached, Maria's thoughts raced, but they were clouded with dread. The world before her felt alien, vast, and oppressive. The pale sky above them was empty, devoid of any warmth or life, casting an eerie pallor over the landscape. The horizon was a sharp, unyielding line, offering no escape. There was no refuge in sight, no boundary that could contain whatever had been unleashed. The realization settled heavily in Maria's chest. They were trapped. Elena had stopped rocking now. She stood motionless, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring into the emptiness. Her fingers twitched around her son, but she made no move to flee or fight. It was as if she, too, was paralyzed, caught in a trance deeper than anything Maria could understand. The boy, the strange child who had initiated this curse, had ceased chanting, but the damage was done. His eyes, still glowing with an unnatural light, locked onto Maria, and his expression twisted in an unreadable mix of amusement and something darker. Maria wanted to shout at Elena to run, to wake her from this spell that seemed to have taken over both mother and child, but her voice was strangled by the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that gripped her. The very air felt suffocating, pressing in on her chest as though the world itself was closing in. Each step she took felt like a struggle, as if the ground was trying to pull her into its depths. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. With every passing second, Maria's heart pounded harder. The rhythm was unmistakable now, a slow, deliberate march, as though something far greater than they could comprehend was drawing near. It was a sound that did not belong in this place. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had not walked the earth for eons. Maria wanted to look, to see what was coming, but she couldn't bring herself to turn her head. The fear was too great. Then, from the corners of her vision, she saw them, shadows, dark and shifting. At first, they were indistinct forms, just ripples in the air. But as they approached, they solidified, becoming more defined. Figures in tattered robes, their faces obscured by hoods, moved toward them like specters. There were no eyes, only empty voids where faces should have been. Their presence was overwhelming, a weight that pushed down on her very soul. The boy's eyes flickered as he turned his head slightly, acknowledging the approaching figures, and for a fleeting moment, Maria thought she saw a shadow of fear in his expression. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced once again by the haunting serenity that had taken over him since their arrival. He didn't speak, but his presence was like a command. His stillness was enough to keep them frozen in place, trapped in whatever realm they now inhabited. Maria could feel the power of the figures growing, their very being reverberating with an energy she couldn't place. The air seemed to shimmer with their movement, and the landscape around them seemed to shift with every step they took. It was as if the ground itself trembled beneath their advance, as though it recognized their presence and was reacting to their command. One of the hooded figures stepped forward, its movement almost imperceptible, yet its presence seemed to fill the space. It reached out with a hand, long fingers extended toward the boy. For a moment, there was no sound but the faint crackle of the air around them. The tension was palpable. Maria's breath hitched in her chest as the figure made contact with the boy's shoulder. The moment their skin touched, something in the air changed. It was as if a dam had burst open, releasing a flood of energy that pulsed through the ground, through her very being. The boy's eyes flashed with an intensity that startled Maria. His lips parted, but instead of words, there was a sound, a high-pitched, otherworldly screech that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of the air. It was a sound that no human voice could make, a noise that rattled her bones and shattered her thoughts. The figures around them reacted instantly, drawing back slightly, as if they too were affected by the boy's cry. And then, just as suddenly, the air grew still again. The boy's face contorted with a mix of pain and power, his once serene expression now distorted. The shadows around him seemed to writhe, as if they were alive, as if they were responding to his pain. The land beneath them cracked again, and this time, the fissures were larger, deeper, more menacing. Maria stumbled back, her heart racing, unsure of what to do next. She couldn't understand what was happening, but she knew they were running out of time. The hooded figures didn't speak, but they moved closer, their presence suffocating. One of them reached up and removed its hood, revealing a face that was not human, a twisted, contorted visage with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched far too wide. The figure smiled, and Maria's blood ran cold. It spoke, and the words that left its mouth weren't words at all, but a series of guttural noises, as if trying to form something that existed beyond human comprehension. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, scraping at the very fabric of her mind. But Maria heard it, or at least she felt it. The language was ancient, one that had not been spoken in eons. And though she couldn't understand the words, the intent was clear. This was no ordinary ritual. This was no simple summoning. Something had been awoken, something beyond the scope of their understanding, something that had been dormant for far too long. And now, it was reaching out. It had found them. Maria's world shifted again. The ground trembled as the figures closed in around them, their hands outstretched toward the boy. The boy's face twisted in pain once more, but his eyes were locked onto Maria now. There was something there, something in his gaze that she had never seen before. He wasn't a victim of this, as she had first thought. He was part of it. He had become a part of something far darker than anything she could have imagined. And then, the world cracked open completely. In that final moment, Maria understood. The veil wasn't just a barrier, it was a prison. And whatever had been locked away, whatever had been waiting on the other side, had finally broken free. The world around Maria felt as though it were coming undone. The ground cracked beneath her feet, and the air shimmered with an otherworldly energy that was both suffocating and liberating. The hooded figures surrounded the boy now, their movements synchronized and almost ritualistic. The boy himself, this strange, cursed child, had become the epicenter of an event that transcended all logic and understanding. Maria had known fear before, but this was something far worse. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown. It was the terror of witnessing something so profoundly alien, so deeply unnatural, that her very existence felt like a fragile thread being severed with each passing moment. The figures seemed to be drawn to the boy's suffering, their fingers trembling as they hovered over him. But it was not an act of compassion. It was an offering of sorts, an act of reverence. The boy, despite the pain contorting his features, was still the focal point of their power. There was a silence in the air that seemed to grow heavier with each second, pressing down on Maria's chest until she could barely breathe. She could feel the weight of what was happening, though she still didn't understand it fully. As the shadows shifted around them, she looked back at Elena. The woman stood frozen, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. She was barely aware of her surroundings, her grip on her son weakening with every passing moment. The connection between mother and child had already been severed, it seemed, or perhaps it had never truly existed in the way Maria had believed. Elena wasn't part of this. She was no longer a player in this twisted ritual. She was a mere observer, trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape. Maria turned her attention back to the boy. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, it was as if time itself had stopped. He didn't speak, but his gaze seemed to convey a message that cut through the air like a blade. He wasn't the innocent victim she had imagined him to be. No, he was something far more dangerous, something that had been waiting, dormant for years, and now it had awakened. It was as if he had always been a part of this, a vessel for something much greater than himself. And in that moment, Maria realized that he had never been in control. He was being manipulated, just as they all were. A sudden chill swept through the air, and Maria's breath became visible, clouding in front of her. The shadows around them seemed to deepen, becoming more solid, more tangible. The space they occupied had no beginning and no end, no edges, no boundaries. The figures, still silent, began to chant, their voices a low hum that vibrated through the very fabric of the world. The boy's expression shifted, his face twisting with an unbearable force. His mouth moved, but it wasn't him speaking. The words came from deep within him, a voice that wasn't his own, a language that was older than the earth itself. Maria wanted to run. She wanted to flee from this nightmare and never look back. But her feet were rooted to the ground. It was as if the very air had become thick, the atmosphere alive with an energy that held her in place. She could see the figures now, really see them, and they were not human. Their faces were obscured by the hoods, but there was something about them, something unnatural about the way they moved. They were not flesh and bone, but shadow and form, manifestations of something that existed outside the realm of human comprehension. And then, the boy screamed. It was a sound unlike any she had ever heard, a raw, primal cry that reverberated through the very earth. The figures reacted, their bodies vibrating with the force of the sound. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the sky seemed to crack open above them. For a split second, Maria thought she saw something immense and dark, lurking beyond the veil, beyond the boundary between worlds. It was an entity, an ancient force that had been imprisoned for centuries, and it was no longer content to remain hidden. The boy's scream escalated, becoming a deafening wail that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality. The figures around him began to writhe, their bodies contorting as if they were being pulled into the vortex of energy that swirled around them. The air grew thick, heavy with power, as the veil, the barrier that had held everything back, began to fray and unravel. Maria felt a pull, a gravitational force that seemed to drag her toward the boy, toward the epicenter of this unfolding nightmare. It was as if something was reaching for her, pulling her into its grasp. Desperation flooded her mind. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't allow whatever this was to break free. But how? How could she stop something so ancient, so beyond human understanding? She had no answers, no solutions. She was a mere spectator in a game that was far older than humanity itself. The boy's scream began to morph into something else, something deeper, more guttural. His body contorted violently, as though it were no longer his own. The light in his eyes flickered, dimming as though something was trying to extinguish it. The shadows around them seemed to close in, pressing in on Maria from all sides. Her heart raced as she realized that whatever had been locked away for so long was now trying to break free, and it was doing so through the boy. He was the vessel, the key, and as the veil unraveled, it became clear that there was no turning back. The figures around the boy moved with purpose now. One of them stepped forward, raising a hand toward the sky, as if calling to the entity beyond. A low, resonating hum filled the air, vibrating in Maria's chest, and then, as if in response, a terrible silence fell over them. It was the silence of the void, the silence of something too terrible to comprehend. And in that silence, Maria understood. The veil had been torn, and now they were all at the mercy of whatever had been imprisoned on the other side. As Maria stood there, paralyzed by the overwhelming presence of the forces now at play, the very fabric of reality seemed to tremble around her. The boy, once the innocent symbol of hope in this nightmare, had transformed before her eyes. His body no longer appeared human. The agony that twisted his features had evolved into something much more dangerous. His form was being overtaken by whatever entity had been sealed for so long. And the veil that had once shielded this power from the world was now dissolving, leaving nothing in its wake but a sense of deep, unshakable dread. Maria's mind struggled to process what was happening. Her body ached from the weight of the energy that radiated from the boy, the figures around him, and the unseen force lurking just beyond the veil. The air itself seemed to thicken, and with every breath she took, it felt as if her lungs were being filled with something foreign, something suffocating. The shadows cast by the hooded figures seemed to grow longer, as though they were reaching out to claim her. The sense of claustrophobia in the space was unbearable. And yet, despite the terror that gripped her, there was something that beckoned her forward, an irresistible pull toward the epicenter of the unfolding chaos. The boy's scream reached a fever pitch. It was no longer a cry of pain, but a primal sound that seemed to echo from the deepest recesses of the earth. His mouth stretched wide, distorting as though his very being were being pulled apart. The shadows around him wriggled, twisting like serpents, as if they were alive and feeding off his torment. Maria could feel the pressure of it all, the vibrations in the air, the heavy thrum of energy gathering around the boy, and the presence of the figures, which had grown increasingly malevolent with each passing moment. In the midst of this darkness, Maria's gaze turned toward Elena. The mother was no longer standing as the concerned protector she had once been. Her posture was slumped, and her eyes were vacant, as if the essence of her being had been siphoned away. The bond between mother and son had been severed, replaced by something much darker, an empty vessel where love and connection had once existed. Elena's face had become a mask of despair, her expression lifeless, as though she too had been consumed by the malevolent force that now surged through the boy. Maria's heart sank. She had been clinging to the hope that there was still something human left in the boy, something that could be saved, something she could fight for. But that hope was now slipping away, like sand through her fingers. The boy had become the vessel, and his suffering was the conduit through which something much older, much more sinister, would enter their world. She could feel it, the dark energy pouring out of him, filling the space with a suffocating presence that seemed to distort reality itself. The figures moved again, their motions precise and deliberate. Their faces, still hidden beneath the hoods, were now more defined, more corporeal. The shadows around them twisted like smoke, undulating with a life of their own. Their hands rose in unison, reaching toward the sky as though they were trying to make contact with the entity on the other side of the veil. The air seemed to crackle with power as the figures chanted, their voices blending into a single, cohesive sound, a dark melody that reverberated deep within Maria's bones. Maria's thoughts raced. There had to be a way to stop this. There had to be something she could do. The boy wasn't truly evil. He couldn't be. He had been a pawn, a puppet caught in the web of these shadowy figures. But as she looked at him now, at his contorted form and the malevolent energy spilling from his body, she wasn't so sure. She wasn't even sure what was real anymore. Was the boy still in there? Or had he been completely consumed? And if he was gone, then what was left to save? Her eyes darted around the space, looking for something, anything, that might offer a solution. But there was nothing. The darkness had swallowed everything, and the very air seemed to pulse with the impending arrival of whatever ancient entity had been trapped behind the veil. The feeling of inevitability was overwhelming. She could sense it now, the power that was about to breach this world, the force that had been held back for centuries, now free to unleash its fury upon them. In a moment of clarity, Maria realized the true horror of what was happening. It wasn't just the boy who had been trapped. The boy was a vessel, yes, but so was she. They all were. This wasn't just about the boy's transformation. It was about the unraveling of everything that held the world together. The veil that separated this world from whatever lay beyond had been constructed to protect humanity from forces it was never meant to confront. But now that veil was crumbling, and as it did, it allowed something to slip through that could not be stopped. Her mind flashed to the warning signs she had ignored, the strange occurrences, the whispers, the tension that had lingered ever since she had arrived. They had all been pieces of a puzzle she had failed to see. This was not just about one boy or one family. This was a cosmic event, a breach in the fabric of reality itself. She had been chosen to witness it, perhaps even to play a part in it. But now that she understood the magnitude of what was at stake, she felt nothing but helplessness. The boy's scream finally subsided, leaving only a lingering hum that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath them. The hooded figures stepped back, their ritual complete. The shadows, now twisted and unnerving, began to pull away from the boy's body, leaving behind something that was no longer recognizable. The boy had become a shell, a mere conduit for whatever force had been waiting on the other side. Maria's heart pounded in her chest as she realized with chilling certainty that the entity was no longer confined. It had crossed over, and it was free. The world around Maria seemed to stand still, frozen in the aftermath of the boy's transformation. The atmosphere was thick with an almost tangible energy, as if the very air was vibrating with the presence of the entity that had crossed over. It wasn't just a physical presence, it was a feeling, an overwhelming weight pressing down on her mind, heart, and soul. She could feel the change deep within herself, as if the boundaries between the real and the unreal had been breached in ways that were far beyond her comprehension. She took a hesitant step forward, though every instinct in her body screamed for her to turn and run. But what could she possibly escape from now? The reality she had known was already slipping away, unraveling before her eyes. The boy, no, the vessel that had once been a boy was gone. What stood before her now was something much darker, much older, and far more dangerous than anything she had ever encountered. The shadows that clung to its form seemed to breathe, alive with a malevolent energy that sent shivers down her spine. And the eyes, those empty, soulless eyes that stared into her with an eerie, unblinking gaze, were the eyes of something that had not been part of this world for centuries. Maria felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead, her thoughts scattered, her breath shallow. The once clear boundaries of reality had dissolved, and now she was trapped in a world of her own fear and uncertainty. The entity, whatever it was, had freed itself, and with it, the veil between the worlds had been torn. But what price would they pay for this freedom? The boy had been nothing more than a sacrifice, his body consumed by the ritual, his soul lost to the darkness. But the cost had not ended there. No, the true cost of this freedom was something far more insidious. The hooded figures, now standing motionless in the periphery, seemed to have completed their task. Their once rigid posture had softened, but they showed no signs of retreating. Maria could feel their eyes on her, their silent judgment weighing on her. She was no longer just a bystander to the unfolding horror. She was part of it. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. She had been brought here for a reason. She had been chosen, perhaps even manipulated, for some greater purpose, a purpose that she could not yet fully grasp. The shadows around the boy-turned entity continued to shift and twist, growing more intense as the moment stretched on. Maria's mind raced, desperate for any semblance of logic in a world that no longer made sense. Could there be a way to undo what had been done? Could she somehow reverse the ritual, close the gateway before it consumed everything? The questions spun in her mind, but the answers remained elusive, like fragments of a dream slipping through her fingers. But then something within her shifted. It wasn't the panic that had initially gripped her, nor was it the overwhelming sense of fear that had clouded her judgment. It was something deeper, a realization that she couldn't ignore. The entity before her was not a mindless force of destruction. It was intelligent, aware, and it was waiting for her to make the next move. It was as if it knew her fear, knew her hesitation, knew her doubts. And in that knowledge, it had found a way to bend her to its will. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, rustling the trees and sending a chill through Maria's body. The shadows seemed to ripple, almost as if the entity were testing its newfound power. The ground beneath her feet trembled, the earth itself seemingly reacting to the arrival of something that should not have been. The hooded figures took a step forward, their movements synchronized, as if they were now part of a greater plan, one that had been set in motion long before Maria had ever crossed into this place. Maria's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to steady her breath. She could no longer deny the truth of her situation. She was no longer in control. The entity was not just a malevolent force. It was an agent of change, a force of nature that had been waiting for the right moment to break free. And that moment had come. The world as she knew it was already slipping away, and with it, the understanding of who she was and what she had believed in. The rules of reality were shifting beneath her feet, and there was no going back. The entity's presence seemed to grow stronger, filling every inch of the space with an oppressive weight. Maria's thoughts raced, her mind grasping for any shred of hope. But there was no escape from the truth now. She had been brought here to witness the unraveling, to see the end of what she had known. The veil had been torn, and with it, the delicate balance between the world of the living and the world beyond had been shattered. There would be no simple resolution to this nightmare. She could not close the gate. She could not undo what had been done. The only thing left to do was to face the consequences of the choices that had led her here. As the entity's form began to shift again, Maria knew that she was at the center of something much greater than herself. She had been caught in a web of fate, drawn into a conflict that stretched far beyond her understanding. She had been witness to a cosmic event, one that would leave scars on the very fabric of existence. The price of this freedom, she realized, was not just the boy's life. It was the unraveling of reality itself. And now that the gate had been opened, there was no telling what would come through next. But Maria knew one thing with chilling certainty. The entity was not done yet. As the days passed, Maria could feel the weight of what had happened press harder against her chest. The darkness that had been unleashed upon the world had taken root deeply within her, as though it had been a seed planted in her very soul. She had hoped that with time, the reality of the situation would dull, that the world would return to some semblance of normalcy. But the opposite was true. The events of that night continued to reverberate through every waking moment, and the boundary between the known and the unknown had become thinner with each passing hour. It wasn't just the physical world that was changing. The fabric of her perception, too, was unraveling. Things no longer seemed as they had once been. The weather, once predictable and familiar, had become erratic. Nights colder than they should be, mornings heavy with an eerie fog that never seemed to lift. The landscape around her, too, felt wrong, distorted, as though it were bending under some unseen pressure. As if the very land she stood on was alive with some dark force, contorting and shifting beneath her feet. At night, she no longer slept soundly. Her dreams were fractured, nightmares in which shadows and whispers twisted in the corners of her mind, barely escaping her conscious grasp. Each dream felt like a warning, a glimpse into a world she was not meant to see. They were full of cryptic messages, of faces she couldn't recognize, and of landscapes that seemed impossibly distant and familiar all at once. The entity, the thing that had once been a boy, loomed large in these dreams, watching her with its cold, empty eyes, silently waiting for her to make a choice. But what choice remained to her? What could she do against something so ancient, so powerful, that it seemed to transcend time and space? It was during one of these restless nights, as she lay tossing and turning in bed, that she first heard the whisper. At first, it was so faint that she thought she might have imagined it, a trick of her tired mind. But then, it came again, a low, guttural murmur, too distinct to ignore. "You cannot hide." The words echoed in her ears, reverberating with an unnatural cadence, like the voice of someone who had not spoken for centuries. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding, her eyes wide with fear. But the room was empty, the darkness silent. No sign of the presence that had haunted her dreams. Nothing but the quiet rustle of the wind outside. Yet she could not shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge it. Days blurred together, each one feeling more surreal than the last. Maria's interactions with those around her became strained, as if the veil that separated the mundane from the supernatural had lifted, leaving her exposed. Her friends and colleagues spoke to her, but their words seemed muffled, distant. Their faces, once familiar, now appeared foreign, as if they belonged to a different reality. She could no longer connect with them as she once had. It was as if the events that had unfolded at the border had created a rift, one that separated her from everyone she had once known. She had crossed into a new world, one in which the rules of reality were no longer clear. It was then that the first strange occurrence happened, something that could not be so easily dismissed. Maria was sitting at her kitchen table, sipping coffee and trying to clear her mind, when she noticed a shadow move outside her window. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the light, but as she looked closer, she saw it again, swift, deliberate, moving across the yard. She stood up, her legs shaky, and moved to the window. The yard was empty, the dark of night casting everything in an oppressive silence. There was no sign of the figure she had seen, no trace of its movement. But the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she felt the creeping sensation of being watched once again. The next day, the strange events began to escalate. Maria could no longer deny that something was terribly wrong. She began seeing fleeting glimpses of things she could not explain, shadows that moved without a source, people in the corner of her vision that disappeared when she turned her head. It was as if the world itself was beginning to fold in on itself, warping in ways that defied logic. And always in the background, there was the feeling of someone lurking just out of sight waiting. Her mind raced with questions, but the answers were as elusive as ever. What had the ritual truly unleashed? Was it the entity that had possessed the boy, or was there something even darker at work, something far beyond her comprehension? And more importantly, why had it chosen her? She had never asked to be part of this, never sought out the horrors that had unfolded before her. And yet, somehow, she had been pulled into the heart of it all. The thought gnawed at her. What role did she play in this cosmic puzzle? Was she merely a pawn, a helpless bystander to forces far beyond her understanding? Or was there something more to it, something that she had yet to uncover? The idea of running, of escaping, seemed more and more impossible with each passing day. Wherever she went, the disturbances followed her. The shadows, the whispers, the overwhelming sense of being watched. They were not confined to any one place. It was as if the darkness had seeped into her very being, spreading with each passing moment. She had been marked, whether she knew it or not. There was no running from it now. And then, one evening, as she sat alone in her living room, a soft knock echoed from the front door. Maria's pulse quickened. She had not expected anyone. There had been no reason for a visitor. Tentatively, she rose from the couch and made her way toward the door. As her hand reached for the handle, she hesitated. Something about this felt wrong, as though opening the door would expose her to some unimaginable fate. But curiosity, or perhaps the haunting pull of the unknown, won out. She turned the handle and opened the door. No one was there, but as she looked down, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, at the threshold of her home, was a small, weathered stone. A stone she recognized from the ritual that had taken place so long ago. She picked it up with trembling hands, her breath catching in her throat. It was a symbol of the dark forces she had tried to ignore, a reminder that the horrors she had witnessed had not been contained. They were still out there, and they were coming for her. Maria's hands shook as she clutched the stone, the weight of its presence unbearable. She had hoped, in some corner of her mind, that the horror of the past few days was merely a nightmare, something her exhausted brain had conjured. But the stone, in its simple, yet unmistakable, form was proof that there was something much darker at play. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and the forces that had been unleashed were now drawing closer, as if the world itself was pulling her toward an inevitable end. Her home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on her with every passing second. She carefully set the stone down on the kitchen table, her mind racing. What did it mean? Why had it appeared at her door after everything that had happened? The stones had been part of the ritual that had awakened something far beyond human comprehension. But had it truly been the boy who had caused the curse? Or was there something more sinister beneath the surface? Something she had yet to understand? She couldn't be certain. She couldn't even trust her own senses anymore. The line between what was real and what was imagined had blurred to the point of non-existence. Maria paced the room, her thoughts spiraling. She needed answers, desperately. But who could she turn to now? The authorities? They would never believe her. They would see her as a woman on the brink of a breakdown, a woman who had lost touch with reality. And she had no proof, no physical evidence that could convince anyone of what was happening. All she had was her own growing sense of dread, her instincts that screamed that something far more ancient and dangerous was closing in on her. Suddenly, she remembered the old woman, the one who had spoken cryptically to her at the border. Her words came back to Maria like a distant echo. The border between life and death is thinner than you think. Once you cross it, there's no turning back. The old woman had known more than she had let on. Had Maria unknowingly crossed some ancient threshold? Was this the price she was now paying for her involvement in the ritual? It seemed more and more likely that her fate had been sealed long before she realized it. The question that haunted her most now was whether she was simply a victim in this twisted game, or if she was something more. Could it be that she was part of the curse, a crucial piece of a puzzle she hadn't yet figured out? Could the boy, the stone, the ritual, could they all be leading her somewhere? To what end? She didn't know, but she could feel it in her bones. The answers were out there, and the closer she got to finding them, the closer she got to the thing that waited in the shadows. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. For a moment, she stood frozen, her heart racing. She hadn't expected anyone, and the very idea of opening the door to another visitor filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. The knocking came again, louder this time. Reluctantly, she made her way to the door, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. What if it was them? What if the forces she had awakened were now here, at her doorstep? She opened the door slowly, her eyes scanning the empty porch. To her relief, there was no one there. But as her gaze fell to the ground, she saw another object. This time, it was a small wooden figurine carved in the shape of a bird. She bent down to pick it up, and as her fingers brushed against the wood, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The figurine was almost too familiar. It wasn't just any bird. It was the same bird from her dreams. The one that had appeared in the fleeting images, always perched on a dark, twisted branch, watching her with eyes full of malice. A terrible thought crossed her mind. Could it be that the entity, or whatever force had been pulling the strings all this time, was somehow communicating with her? Was this figurine a message, a symbol of its growing influence? The bird, its eyes, were watching her, waiting for her to understand. But what did it mean? And why was it always so close, always so persistent in its presence? Trembling, she backed away from the door and slammed it shut, locking it behind her. She could feel her sanity slipping further with each passing moment. The world was no longer a place she recognized. The normal, the mundane, had been stripped away, leaving only shadows and whispers. The walls of her home felt like a cage now, one that she couldn't escape. The lines between reality and nightmare had merged, and she was caught in the center of it all, unable to escape, unable to breathe. That night, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. This time, they were more vivid, more real. She could feel the presence of the entity in her dreams, its cold eyes following her through the darkness, its voice whispering promises of things she couldn't understand. It spoke of an ancient power, one that had been buried for centuries, and how it had found its way to her. The boy, the stone, the figurine, it was all part of the ritual, part of the plan, and Maria was at the center of it. But what did it want from her? What was the ultimate purpose of all this madness? The next morning, she woke up in a cold sweat, her mind racing. The images from her dream still lingered in the corners of her vision, fading slowly as she tried to shake off the sense of unease. She knew one thing for certain now. There was no escaping this nightmare. She had been marked, and whatever waited for her in the shadows was closing in. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the window. Outside, the world seemed unchanged, calm, peaceful even. But Maria knew better now. It was all a facade. Behind every corner, behind every shadow, something waited. The border between the living and the dead had never been thinner, and she had crossed it long ago. Now, she was trapped between two worlds, with nowhere to hide and no one to help her. The unraveling had only just begun. Maria had reached the point where everything felt like a fever dream, an endless loop of horror and realization, a spiral she couldn't escape from. The days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. Her mind was unraveling, as though it was no longer her own. Every creak of the house, every whisper in the wind felt like a warning, an omen of something inevitable approaching. But despite this, she couldn't bring herself to leave. The terror that had gripped her was now so profound that it anchored her to this place. The ritual, the boy, the stone, the figurines. All of it seemed so deeply entwined with her fate that to leave would be to forfeit whatever was still left of her sanity. She stared at the stone again, its smooth surface gleaming in the dim light of the room. It no longer seemed like just a relic, a piece of some forgotten past. It felt like an invitation to understand, to unravel the mystery that had ensnared her. But the deeper she delved into it, the more she felt herself being pulled towards something far darker. The boy's face haunted her thoughts constantly now, and his expression, the way his eyes seemed to reflect something ancient and horrifying, haunted her every waking moment. He had known something that had been hidden from her, and she was desperate to know what it was. It was then that she received a letter. It arrived without warning, shoved through the mailbox like an afterthought. She had been expecting nothing. The authorities had never responded to her calls, and she had stopped reaching out to anyone else long ago. The letter was thick and unmarked, but the moment her fingers brushed against it, a cold shiver ran down her spine. It was as if the letter itself was aware of the weight of the past few days. Her pulse quickened and she almost didn't open it, but she couldn't resist. Some part of her knew that it held the final key to understanding everything that had happened. With trembling hands, she tore open the envelope. Inside was a single page, a note that was written in jagged, hurried handwriting. The line between life and death is thinner than you think. You crossed it long ago, Maria, but the end is not yet here. The boy is waiting. The stone is calling you. To step forward is to break the chains of fate, or to be bound by them forever. You cannot run from what is coming. You never could. The words blurred before her eyes as her heart pounded in her chest. The old woman's words echoed in her ears. The border between life and death is thinner than you think. But this letter, this cryptic warning, it was a direct challenge. It was clear now that there was no escaping what was happening. There was no running, no turning back. She had been thrust into this nightmare, and no matter what she did, she would never be able to escape its grasp. But why? Why her? With the letter still clutched in her hand, Maria stumbled toward the front door. She had to go. She had to find the boy. The letter had given her no answers, only more questions, but something in her gut told her that she had to follow this path. The stone, the boy, the ritual, it was all leading her to this moment. She was drawn to it now, like a moth to a flame, and though fear gripped her, there was something else as well, a sense of inevitability. She couldn't run anymore. The door opened slowly, the creaking sound reverberating through the stillness of her home. Outside, the sky was clouded over, the air heavy with tension. The world seemed muted, as though it too were holding its breath. Maria's steps were slow, but determined as she walked down the path toward the border. The border. She had once thought of it as just a place, an arbitrary line separating countries. But now, she knew better. It was far more than that. It was a place where realities collided, where worlds overlapped, where life and death could intertwine in ways no one understood. And now she was going there, knowingly stepping into the heart of that place, with no clear idea of what awaited her. The border station loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the gray sky. She could see the faint outline of the figure in the distance, the boy. He stood motionless, staring directly at her as if he had been waiting for her to arrive. His face was familiar, but his expression had changed. The innocence that had once marked his features was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling. His eyes were too knowing, too ancient, as if he had seen beyond the veil of life and death and had returned with knowledge that no human should ever possess. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The final threshold was before her. She was standing on the precipice of something she didn't fully understand, something that defied everything she had ever known. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to run, to escape. But it was too late. She had crossed the point of no return long ago. She had walked into this nightmare step by step, and now there was no way to undo it. The boy began to move toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. His shadow stretched long across the ground, merging with hers, and for a brief moment, Maria felt a flicker of recognition. This wasn't just a boy. This was a guide, a messenger, a part of something far more ancient than she could comprehend. He reached out to her, his hand extending toward the stone she had left behind in her home. Her heart pounded in her chest as the boy's fingers brushed against it. And in that instant, everything shifted. The air grew thick, the world seemed to tilt, and Maria felt herself being pulled into something far beyond the physical realm. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The ground beneath her feet seemed to disintegrate as she fell into darkness, her body weightless, her mind lost in a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The last thing she saw before the world swallowed her whole was the boy's eyes, cold, ancient, and full of terrible understanding. And then there was nothing. Maria had always thought that death was a finite end, a clear line separating the living from the dead. But now, as she floated in the thick, endless void, she realized how wrong she had been. The boundary between life and death, between the living world and the realm beyond, was far more permeable than she could have ever imagined. There was no clear divide, no definitive boundary. There was only this, the endless space where time didn't exist, where the rules of reality were suspended, and where her own identity felt fragile, like a fleeting thought. For what felt like eternity, Maria drifted through the void, unanchored and weightless. It wasn't peaceful. There was no sense of tranquility, no release from the terror that had plagued her since the first night she encountered the boy. Instead, there was only an overwhelming feeling of being lost, of being caught between two worlds, neither of which she could truly belong to. The silence was deafening, and though she could not see anything, she knew she wasn't alone. There was something here, something watching her, something waiting. It was as if the very fabric of this place was alive with whispers, distant voices that murmured just out of her reach. Suddenly, the darkness parted. The void seemed to ripple and twist as the world she had once known began to reform around her. Slowly, the edges of reality came into focus, and Maria found herself standing once again, though this time, not in her home. She was at the border, the very place where she had first encountered the boy. But now it was different. The station was no longer a familiar structure. It was warped, distorted, as though it had been torn from another dimension and reassembled here. The sky above was no longer gray. It was a swirling mass of colors, a chaotic storm of reds and blacks. And there, standing in the middle of the border, was the boy. He was no longer the innocent child she had seen before. His face had shifted, become something other, something impossible. His eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and the shadows around him seemed to flicker, moving of their own accord. There was a weight to him now, a presence that felt as though it could suffocate the very air. He had changed just as she had, and in that moment Maria understood. She wasn't just here to understand the boy's past or the secrets of the stone. She had become part of something much larger, a force, a cosmic cycle that had been unfolding for eons. The boy stepped forward, and though his body was still human, it was as though he was something more, something older, something that existed beyond the physical. As he approached, his lips parted, and for the first time, his voice reached her. It was not a sound, not a mere vibration in the air. It was something deeper, a communication that bypassed language altogether. The boy's words were felt, not heard. They pressed against her consciousness, seeping into her mind like a strange, foreign tide. "You have crossed the threshold, Maria. You've seen the truth." Her heart raced. She wanted to respond, to ask questions, but no words came. She could only watch, as if paralyzed, as the boy continued to speak in that strange, telepathic manner. "You think you came here by choice. You think you stumbled upon this border, that you made the decision to cross into this place. But you were always meant to be here. You have always been a part of this cycle." Maria's chest tightened as a cold realization washed over her. The boy was right. She had never truly made the decision to walk into this world. She had never chosen to step beyond the edge of what she knew. It had always been a part of her, this nightmare, this twisted reality that had taken hold of her. Her life had never been hers to begin with. She was merely a player in a game far larger, far older than anything she could comprehend. The stone, the boy continued, was never just an object. It was a key that unlocked the door between this world and the next. You thought you were finding the answers, but now you see, you've only unlocked more questions. Maria felt herself recoil. She had always believed that the stone was the key to her understanding, the object that could unravel the mystery of the boy's presence, the strange events surrounding her, and the border she had crossed. But now she understood. The stone was not a simple relic. It was a bridge, a portal, and through it, she had been pulled into a game she didn't understand. "But now, Maria," the boy's voice echoed in her mind, "you are the key. You are the one who will open the final door. Your journey is not over. It's only just begun." The words stung her like 1,000 needles. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't. The boy had become a part of her, and she was a part of this world now, bound to it forever. There was no escape, No return to her old life. Everything she had known had been torn away, leaving her with nothing but the knowledge that the boundaries between the living and the dead were always porous, always shifting, always in motion. As the boy stepped back, his figure dissolving into the swirling chaos of the border station, Maria felt her own body begin to shift. She wasn't in control anymore. Her hands reached toward the stone that had once been her only connection to the world she understood. But as her fingers closed around it, the final door opened before her. It wasn't a door to another world, but a door to herself, into the very heart of the cycle she had been drawn into. And as she stepped through, she understood this was not just her fate. This was the fate of every soul who had ever crossed the border, every person who had unknowingly stepped into this world. They were all players in a game that had no end, no finality. It was a cycle that had been repeating for eons, and she, Maria, was no different from any of them. The door closed behind her, and the world she had once known was lost to the winds of time. Now, there was only the border, the place where life and death met, where realities collided, and where every soul was bound by the same eternal truth. There was no escape.